Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you, wherever you are joining us from. My name is Nathalie Giroir, and I am the head of the Environmental Performance and Information Division at the OECD Environment Directorate. So it's my great pleasure to moderate today's Green Talks live on Do Climate Policies Deliver? Evidence on Emissions and Carbon Leakage. So we have an excellent program today bringing together OECD data, cutting-edge research and policy analysis to examine a simple but very critical question: which climate policies deliver and under what conditions? To open this session, Jaime de Bourbon de Palme, Director of the OECD Environment Directorate, will provide a brief introductory remarks, and then my colleague Danielle Nightingale will present insights from OECD climate policy data. And we will then hear from three speakers who have used this data to generate policy-relevant evidence. So a very warm welcome to Annika Steschenmesser from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Welcome, Annika. Yves Steinebach from the University of Oslo. Welcome, Yves. And Yannick Emmerle from the OECD Economics Department. Hello, Yannick. So after these presentations, we will open the floor for questions. You can send your question at any time during the event using the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will try to address as many as possible within the time we have available. So before we dive into the evidence, and to set the scene for today's discussion, I'm very pleased to turn the floor to Jaime. Over to you, Jaime.
Thank you, Nathalie, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this Green Talk live webinar. And we're here to discuss the critical question that Nathalie just said: which climate policies actually deliver? And I joined the Environment Directorate as a director in January, so it's half a month ago. But as a climate envoy of the Netherlands, I already called in December in Green Talks Live for the launch of the Environmental Outlook, and I found it very insightful. So I'm very pleased now opening today's discussion from this side of the table as part of the OECD going forward. So I'll be framing the discussion a bit for you, and also the role of the OECD in this, and then we'll have the speakers, as Nathalie said, following me. So on framing, our timing for this discussion could hardly be better. Many countries are moving from agenda setting towards implementation. And this shift comes a sharper focus on how we deliver on climate action, what is effective, what is efficient, and what is scalable. And over the recent decades, governments have introduced thousands of climate policies. But one question remains surprisingly difficult to answer: which policies have actually generate the greatest impact, under which conditions, and in which combination? For example, is a high carbon tax more effective on its own, or does it work best when combined with subsidies, with regulations, energy efficiency standards, or information tools such as energy labels? And this is the focus of our discussion today. Now, what's the role of the OECD? We're living in times where the risk of disinformation is growing, with the real consequence of public trust and the ability to bring all parties together to find solutions for climate action. And the OECD is well positioned to fight back, providing trusted facts, comparable data, and rigorous analyses. And we always view our climate, our environmental policy, and biodiversity policy, and pollution from an economic lens. So while science, and often compare this to a screen with pixels, and you're looking at it right now, gives us a clear picture on how to view the world, and the picture that we see is not a nice one. It's one that is quite dire. The role of the OECD is there to help identify economic pathways of action to move out of it. So in that sense, we are an organization of possibilities, showing how better policies can support stronger economies, greater resilience, and better lives while protecting our planet. Now, good policies start with good evidence, and good evidence starts with trusted, comparable data. And on climate, our data clearly shows two important messages. First, climate policies expanded strongly over the last decade since the Paris Agreement, but slowed down markedly from an annual increase of around 10% to only 1% in the recent years. So it's kind of plateaued. The second one is that countries have moved at very different speeds. And this makes it even more important to understand not only whether countries are acting, but also which policies are being used, how they're designed, and whether they are delivered actually the results. So it's not just about the quantity, but also about the quality of policy. And this is where the OECD climate policy data adds real value. It captures a broad range of policy approaches, showing countries' diverse policy landscapes. It is internationally harmonized, so it allows comparison across countries, and it is validated by countries, which strengthens the credibility and the relevance. Now, together, these features make the OECD data fit for purpose for robust policy analysis. But data is only the starting point. The real value is when data is turned into insights that can support better policy decisions. And let me give you one example. In the United Kingdom, the power sector emissions fell sharply in the mid-2010s, mainly attributed to the carbon price floor introduced at the time. But research by the Potsdam Institute, using OECD climate policy data, showed that carbon pricing alone does not explain the scale of the reduction. The impact came from a broader mix of policies working together, including carbon pricing, renewable energy support schemes, stricter air pollution standards, and the planned phase-out of coal power. And Annika will speak more about these findings later. So today's Green Talks live webinar will provide more of these insights, showing how robust, trusted data and cutting-edge research can help answer practical policy questions. Now, my OECD environment colleagues will first introduce our climate policy data work. We will then hear from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and the University of Oslo, who will present new findings on the impacts of climate policies on emissions. And finally, the colleague from the OECD Economics Department will discuss spillover effects on carbon leakage, which are issues that are central to understanding both domestic and international impacts of climate policy. So I wish you a very good discussion, and I'm handing it back over to Natalie.
Thank you, Jaime, for the scene setting. And without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, my colleague Daniel Nightingale. He's an economist in the OECD Environment Directorate, and he's working on climate policy data. So Daniel, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Natalie. Let me share my screen. So you should be able to see the screen now. Very good. So yes, hello everyone also from my end. Very happy to speak about our climate policy data and present the insights about what the data actually tells us in the next 10 minutes. So here at the OECD, we actually do have a long-standing history and diversity of environmental and climate policy data. So the policy instruments for the environment database, the PINE database, dates actually back to the 1990s. Then in 2022, we have launched the Climate Actions and Policies Measurement Framework, the CAPMF, that was developed under the IPAC program. And actually more recently, we also launched the Climate Policy database under the Inclusive Forum for Carbon Mitigation Approaches. So today I would actually like to focus on the CAPMF because that is the database that has been used by the other speakers. So just very briefly, so CAPMF is a harmonized climate mitigation policy database that covers the core mitigation policies. In terms of coverage, we cover 87 policies that are based on 272 policy variables across 114 countries and a time period from 1990 to 2024. So as Jaime mentioned, the value added of that database is actually threefold. So first, we cover a broad range of different instrument types. So really to capture well countries' diverse policy approaches. Second, our data is internationally harmonized to the extent that we cover for each country and year the same 87 policies. So that ensures comparability and is also key for empirical analysis. And third, we have granular information on climate action. And climate action is actually something that we at the OECD have been concerned with for a long time. So essentially, what is climate action and how do we measure it? And that's actually quite tricky because by its very nature, government's climate action is quite complex and inevitably multidimensional. So ideally, we would like to capture all possible actions of governments that are intended to or contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, along with key policy attributes such as stringency, design features, and enforcement, and so on. However, capturing all this would really require literally like an army of research assistants. So what we do in the CAPMF is that we focus on two key metrics, which are first, the adoption of policies, and second, and that is actually the real value added of the CAPMF compared to most other databases, policy stringency. So we measure policy stringency, for example, for carbon taxes, we have the rate of the carbon tax. For an emission standards, it's the value of the emission standard, or for feed-in tariffs, it's the support level of that feed-in tariff. And that information on policy stringency is actually quite important, because what we observe, in particular for OECD countries in the last years, is that they are increasingly advancing their climate action by tightening existing policies, not by adopting new ones. So only focusing on policy adoption would actually miss a great deal of climate action for these countries. Let me also say that policy stringency is not equal to effectiveness. I mean, of course, there is like a positive correlation between the two, but higher policy stringency does not automatically translate into more effective policies. And let me also just say here that since these different stringency units are quite distinct in their units, we also convert for our database these units into what we call stringency scores that range from 0 to 10 based on a purely data-driven process. And that is, and we will see that later on, to really establish a common unit of analysis, which allows us to aggregate the policies into meaningful categories. So this is the policy scope of the CAPMF. I don't want to spend too much time here, so we will share the slides with you after the seminar, so you can have a detailed and thorough look at them. But just to highlight a few things. So first, we have essentially three building blocks. So sectoral policies, cross-sectoral policies, and international policies. And then within the sectoral policies, we cover the major IPCC emission source sectors, so electricity, transport, buildings, industry, follow, and waste. And within these sectors, for each of these sectors, we have market-based instruments, for example, carbon pricing, but also environmentally positive subsidies for renewable energy or for energy efficiency, and non-market-based instruments such as regulatory instruments or information instruments like labels. And then we also cover, beyond climate policy instruments, we also cover broader climate actions like greenhouse gas emission targets or climate governance. So what you see here in that chart is a subset of the policies from the previous slide that indicates the major policies that are adopted by the previous and the upcoming COPs as of 2024. So it really shows countries' policy landscape in a very descriptive and harmonized way to answer the simple questions: so which policies are actually in place? And let me start with a few observations here. So first, if we look at the very first line of net zero targets, we see essentially that almost all COP hosts have net zero targets in place, and most of them actually aiming for net zero by 2050, with Turkey at the moment the exception. Then also, if we look at minimum energy performance standards for appliances, labels for appliances, or fuel excise taxes, we also see very broad coverage by all the COP hosts. But then we also observe like a few policy gaps. So for example, if we look at passenger cars or phase outs of passenger cars with internal combustion engines, there's currently none of the COP hosts has implemented that policy. And also none of the COP hosts has implemented a carbon tax. However, having said that, so Australia and the United Kingdom, and very soon also Turkey, will have an emission trading scheme. So that's also like an explicit price on carbon emissions. So what we can actually do with these granular data is to sum them up over the number of adopted policies across countries to provide really like a bird's eye view on the evolution of climate policies. And that's essentially what we are doing here. So here we see that graph shows the total number of adopted policies by stringency level. And what we can actually see is from 2010 to 2020, there is a continuous increase. To 2021, there's a continuous increase both in terms of adopted policies, but also in terms of policy stringency. But then from 2021, that curve significantly slows down. So in terms of climate action, so climate action is like a holistic measure that really combines policy adoption and policy stringency. The average annual increase slowed down from 10% before 2021 to 1 to 2% after that. And that slowdown can actually no longer be explained by the COVID-19 pandemic or by the energy crisis. So it really reflects like a loss of momentum in implementing effective policies, potentially because priorities of countries have shifted from climate mitigation to other policy areas such as security. And that is one of the key messages of our flagship report, the Climate Action Monitor. So you can read more about that in the link. And in the monitor, we actually also argue that the slowdown is actually very concerning, in particular in view of what we call like the NDC delivery gap, so which clearly states that countries collectively are currently not on track to meet their 2030 NDC targets. So countries should actually do more to meet their NDCs, but they're not. According to our data, they're not doing that. So what we can also do is we can disaggregate the overall finding and look into different aspects or categories of climate policies. So here we show like a disaggregation by policy instrument type. So again, the y-axis shows climate action, so a combination of policy adoption and policy stringency. And what we can see here is that climate action essentially increased across all instrument types that we have in our database. But what we can also see that market-based instruments such as carbon taxes or subsidies saw the smallest increase and also remain underused. And that is a worrying trend, as these tools are usually considered to be the economically most efficient tools to reduce emissions. What we can also do is to zoom into specific policy domains. So here, for example, energy efficiency policies. So that chart is taken from our recently published data insight on the energy crisis and energy efficiency. And we look into the adoption of energy efficiency policies over time. So the darker the color, the more countries have adopted a particular energy efficiency policy. And what you can see here is that if you look at the first three entries, minimum energy performance standards for appliances, energy efficiency mandates for large emitters, and building energy codes, so these are actually relatively widespread. However, if you look at the bottom, we see all of them are being labeled. So countries still have actually like a lot of room to improve their policies in terms of information instruments. And that might be actually because outcomes of information instruments are usually less predictable than for regulatory standards. So finally, we can also disaggregate our climate policy by different country groups. So here we show that climate action actually evolved along three different paths. So OECD countries had historically the strongest climate action and saw also like the largest increase, followed by non-OECD G20 countries and other non-OECD countries. What is actually quite interesting is that there is an evolving gap between non-OECD G20 countries and also other non-OECD countries. And that different pace of advancing climate action has, of course, implications for international competitiveness. So that will be like a topic that our speaker, Yannick, will speak about later today. And what we can also do is to zoom into developments at the regional level. So here it's a chart from our forthcoming joint report with the Global Green Growth Institute, the World Bank, and our OECD African colleagues on new climate data for Africa's changing climate. So here we show the increase of climate action by African countries between 2010 and 2024. And what we can actually see is that all of the 28 African countries for which we have collected data managed to expand their climate policies, but there are also some regional frontrunners that are emerging. So in particular, South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and with some distance also Morocco. So last slide, we can also use the CAPMF as a diagnostic tool in a particular country context. So that chart here is taken from the last OECD economic survey of Croatia. And the top chart actually shows that Croatia's climate action, so the red line, outpaced that of non-OECD countries and is increasingly catching up with OECD countries. And then we can also dig a little bit deeper into Croatia's policy landscape. So in the lower left panel, you can clearly see that Croatia's policy mix is mostly reliant on non-market-based instruments, so the blue bar. So one of the recommendations in the survey was actually to step up market-based instruments. And then in the lower right panel, you can also see that courageous climate action is below the OECD for all sectors and below that of non-OECD countries for the building sector. So more action may be warranted in that sector. And with that, many thanks for your attention and looking forward to your question. Handing back to Natalie. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, for this presentation and for giving us an overview of the database and some of its usage. I would like now to give the floor to Annika, who's a scientist at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. And Annika will present the recent work of the PIC in collaboration with the University of Oxford and the University of Victoria that was published in the journal Science. So Annika, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Lovely to be here. Let me share my slides. Great. Can you see them? Wonderful. Okay, so today we're going to talk a little bit about what works, and how we want to contribute to that question is by evaluating the climate policy measures over 2 decades. Because what we see from the excellent climate policy data from the OECD that we have used for this project, which encompasses like more than 30,000 policies in 51 countries, covering like really the major share of global emissions, is that the number of climate policy instruments in key high-emitting sectors, such as the building sector, the electricity sector, the industry or the transport sector, has really grown steadily over the last 2 decades. In fact, there's a whole zoo of instruments that are applied, and you don't need to understand all the details here, but what you basically can take away from it is that there's a number of different instruments in every sector that are employed by policymakers. They differ between developed economies and developing economies, which you can see here by the light and by the dark. And we did not have the capacity to evaluate them all and to tell you how effective they actually were. So the question remains, which policies and policy combinations actually cause an emissions reduction? We have tackled this question with a combination of the novel data and a different methodological approach that marries machine learning with classic and econometric approaches to policy evaluation. And the results were published in this study together with a wonderful team. So you can find all the details here online, because I don't have time to go into like the nitty-gritty of it today, unfortunately. Instead, I'm bringing you 3 key messages, and then I'll show you some beautiful graphs to support each of them. So the first one is that emission reductions on a magnitude that matches zero emissions are possible, but need to be scaled. The second key message we can take away from this work is that more policies do not necessarily equate to better outcomes. Instead, we need to find the right policy mix. And the third key message is that pricing is often a critical element of effective policy mixes. Right, so let's get into the first one, emission reduction on a magnitude that matches zero emission targets are possible. So in our study, we detect 63 large emission reductions in 41 countries. So you see that all the countries that are part of this study have like a little square, and a colorful cube here means we found a large emission reduction in the sector, and the average effect size of an emission reduction is 19%. So they are like notable, sizable. So this is the good news, that we find 63 cases, but at the same time, we also only find 63 cases over the last 2 decades. But it is possible. This is the same example that was already mentioned today, and now we can see it in the data, which is maybe actually kind of nice. So for each and every one of these little cubes you've seen on the map, we have all this background information that you see now. And the math is actually kind of stuck in this plot. So we have like the black line here, which shows us the observed CO2 emissions of a country in a sector. In this case, it's the United Kingdom and the electricity sector. And then we see what our model is doing here in the blue line. So it's okay, it's doing quite well, I say. And then here we have these red vertical lines, which show us where the large emission drops were. And these red lines up here is what we would have expected to happen. So this is kind of the reduction we observed. And then here along the bottom, we have all these beautiful colorful cubes. And this is where the policy data come in. So we basically see that all these policies were employed and are associated with this large emission reduction. Here is the famous UK carbon price floor, but we do see that a whole list of policies in a policy mix of regulation, pricing, and subsidies has caused this break. And these kind of insights can be found for every single example in the study, and I will show you in just a moment where to find it. Right, let's go to the second statement, which was that more policies do not necessarily equate better outcomes. And what we see in this study is that the best combination of policies is really dependent on both the sector and the level of economic development in a country. And I've brought you this sort of slightly complicated chart to illustrate this. This is the building sector. And what we have done here is taken all the success cases and said, okay, this success case was caused by a mix of subsidy and regulation policy. This one was caused by a pricing policy by itself. So we have counted out how often the different combinations of policies were successful and visualized it in these little diagrams. So here we see that about 18.2% of successful interventions in the building sector in developed economies were combinations of subsidy and pricing. And what you can take away here basically is that they look quite different between developed and developing economies. And they also look quite different between sectors. Let's have a look at price instruments. And we see that if we compare the effect sizes, which we do here, so this little bar shows you like how much reduction a policy actually caused in a policy mix on the left and by itself on the right. And what we see here is that a lot of these like really popular policies are only ever successful in a mix or more successful in a mix. And then we see this little black line, which tells us how successful they are if price instruments were part of that mix. And if the black line is all the way at the bottom, that means we have found no example where this policy was successful in a mix and no price instrument was there. So the price instrument was can be understood as a crucial enabler here. And in some cases, the price instruments just really push the effectiveness. Yeah. So we do see that they play a bit of a special role. And if we dig into the individual cases, we see that this is in particular true for developed economies, because price instruments are also covered more there, they're employed more. Exactly. So let's briefly talk about what we can take away from the study. Transitioning away from fossil fuels on country level is possible, and upscaling is needed, but does not necessarily need more policies, but the right policy mix. And if you want to dive into all the details, you can of course read the study, or if you'd like to have a little bit more like of a visual tool, you can try out a policy explorer, which is like a web tool, and you can explore by sector and see all the details. Or you can explore every single country case, every single large emission reductions. You can download the data, you can play around with it. It's quite nice. So really happy to share that with everyone. And this link takes you also to a freely accessible version of the study without a paywall. So yeah, exactly. I think that's it for today. And thanks very much.
Thank you, Annika, for your insights and also for sharing all the links and the sources of the data. Let me just remind our audience that if you have any questions for our expert, please feel free to type them in the Q&A function in the Zoom. So next, I would like to introduce our third speaker, Yves Steinbach, professor at the University of Oslo. Yves will present insight from a recent paper on policy effectiveness using our OECD data and also a novel methodology. Yves, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope you can see my screen. So thank you for giving me the chance to present today. So the football World Cup is coming up soon. So I hope it's okay if I start my talk with a reference to football, in particular to Germany. So over the course of a season or tournament, a team plays with different players, different tactics and different formations. And with these different players in these different setups, they get quite different results. And because the coach rotates the players all the time, the team plays in many different constellations, and all we have is the final outcome, that is a win, a loss, or a draw. It becomes generally difficult to figure out who is actually the most valuable player. So who is the one that is consistently making the team better? In that case, Germany. And before you wonder why he's talking about that in this session, the exact same thing actually applies to climate policy. So taking these three countries, Germany, the UK, and Sweden, each deploys a bundle of climate policy instruments. So some instruments they all have in common. So the EU trading scheme, for example, renewable energy support, building standards, vehicle standards, R&D funding, those are our constants. So basically those players that start in more or less every match. But each country also has its own additional instruments. So Germany pushes heat pumps and boiler ban from the famous Heizungsgesetz. The UK adds a carbon price support and an early coal phase out. Sweden runs the world's highest carbon tax, an aviation scheme, and so forth. So these are the rotated players that more or less come in different kind of matches. And just like in football, they play in different formations. So the three countries combine these instruments very differently. Germany is mostly standard-led, the UK is pricing-led, and Sweden mixes up the two. And of course, we observe different outcomes. So Germany is a bit off track, the UK is said to be on track, and Sweden achieves some mixed result. So the question is, which climate policies actually reduce emissions? And this is exactly as difficult to say as picking the most valuable player from a row of football matches. The instruments vary, the combinations vary, the outcomes vary, and the three countries obviously also differ in dozens of other ways: industrial structure, baseline emissions, the coal to gas transition, and so forth. So everything actually moves at once. So the core problem that our paper takes is how can we identify the effect of individual policy measures, individual players, in terms of constant policy change and policy growth. And our approach is to explicitly model all policy parameters. So we include all individual policy measures as distinct variables in the model. We have data on emissions, and we control for all the policies in place. But here's the challenge: with no restriction of which measures to include, the model becomes excessively complex. So too many parameters relative to the observations we have. And that is called overfitting and makes some problems for the prediction. What we do is we address this with Bayesian priors as filters. So put simply, we tell the model how strong the evidence must be that a certain measure makes a difference to finally end up in the model. And here we use three different filters. One, strong evidence of an effect where the effect is otherwise zero. Strong evidence for large negative effect, because we can assume that climate policies should reasonably only reduce emissions. And three, a combination of the both, strong evidence of a negative effect. Our research design is we have outcome is the sectoral level CO2 emissions in building, energy, industry, and transport across 40 countries from 2000 to 2021. The independent variable, that's I guess why we're here, is the CAPFM dataset with the 47 variables they use. And we control for the usual suspects, so GDP per capita, GDP growth, fossil fuel share, industry share, trade openness, and state capacity overall. And because governments self-select into policies, so they kind of self-select into treatment by kind of adopting policy, we apply propensity score matching for each of these 47 variables, which basically mean we calculate how likely it is that a country adopts a certain measure and then plot that likelihood into the model with the intuition that an instrument should work more particularly well in the country that is also likely to adopt that measure. And here you see the results in the heat map. So these are different policies. The colors here are the different sectors. The colors here are the different directions of the effect, but what you should focus on is the bold ones, because these are those where we, with relatively high levels of confidence, can say that there is an effect. And what we do then in the next step is we only take those measures where at least in 2 of these rows we see an effect. So we can be very confident that there is really a difference that is made. And here's the final results broken down by sector. And the picture is quite consistent, I guess. Pricing instruments, so carbon taxes, fossil fuel excise taxes, dominate the top of every sector ranking. Plus, there's some targeted R&D spending, plus some well-designed standards, such as air emission standards in energy or speed limit on motorways. And given that Annika's study was published first, that's always the struggle of a researcher, we had to cross-validate our results with theirs. And we got actually an overlap of like 63%. And where we diverge is primarily because we identified slightly fewer effective measures that they do. So if we relax kind of our assumptions with that kind of, it must be sure in at least 2 models, we kind of reach about an 80% overlap. That is not perfect, given that we use the same kind of data source, but still more than I've seen in other studies. So I guess 80% overlap is quite good on that. So back to football, we provide an approach that let us identify the most valuable player of climate policy. The headline finding is price-based instruments, research and development, and some selected standards are the closest thing a climate policy can come to be an all-season player to reduce emissions across sectors, across countries, and different constellations. And that is something that we can actually get from the data. Thanks for your attention. And if you want to read this in a kind of very digestible version, here's a blog post. And I think that QR code should directly link you to that blog post. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yves, for your insight. Let me move directly to introduce our last speaker. I'm just conscious of time. Yannick, who's an economist at the OECD Economics Department, will present recent work on the effect of climate policy on international spillover and carbon leakage. Yannick, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Natalie, and good day to everyone. I'm sharing my screen now. I hope you can see it. Yes, okay. So yes, in this last presentation, I will focus more on the international spillovers of climate policies, and I will do that by discussing our paper on how different climate policies affect carbon leakage through trade. And this is joint work with Tobias Kruse and Maro Pisu from the Economics Department. So let me start with the basic motivation of this paper. One of the key questions of this paper is whether more stringent climate policies at home increase emissions embodied in imports. And a simple way to think about these imported emissions is that they depend on 2 factors, how much is imported and how carbon intensive those imports are. So following an increase in domestic policy stringency, imported emissions can rise because import volumes increase, because imports become dirtier, or both. And the chart on the right tries to illustrate these concepts through 3 different trends. First, we see that climate policy stringency, as shown by the red line, increased over time across the countries in our sample. Second, we observe that both imported emissions, as shown by the green dashed line, and import volumes, as shown by the blue line, increased strongly until 2014. However, from around 2010 onwards, imports continued to grow, but the emissions embodied in those imports grew less quickly. So in other words, imports became cleaner on average, as shown by the brown dashed line. However, what we see here are just descriptive trends, and trade volumes and imported emissions also depend on many other factors, for which you of course need to control in empirical analysis to isolate the effect of climate policies on emissions and imports. This brings me to the data and methodology used in this paper. So what we do is we combine several data sources to estimate carbon leakage rates and their drivers across different countries and sectors for the period 2000 to 2020. And for climate policy stringency, we use the CAPMF data as discussed today. And importantly, our paper does not only consider aggregate policy stringency, so the stringency of all policy instruments in the CAPMF combined, but we also distinguish between market-based instruments, such as carbon taxes and emission trading systems, non-market-based instruments, such as standards and mandates, and technology support instruments, such as support for clean innovation and deployment. And we do this by using a gravity model of trade to estimate how changes in climate policy stringency affect three outcomes, namely imported emissions, so the CO2 embedded in imports, import volumes, and the carbon intensity of those imports. And this distinction is important because if imported emissions increase only due to a rise in import volumes, the policy concern is different from a case where countries start sourcing dirtier goods from abroad. So let me turn to some first results. The main result is that on average, a 1 unit increase in the aggregate CAPMF of the importer increases imported emissions by around 10%. And important here is that we find that this increase is driven by higher import volumes, which rise by around 11%. At the same time, we find that the CO2 intensity of imports falls by 3%. These results, however, differ across policy instruments. So market-based instruments appear to drive the increase in imported emissions through both higher import volumes, as shown in the middle of the chart, and by increasing the carbon intensity of imports, as shown on the right side of the chart. Then still focusing on the right side of the chart, we find that technology support instruments, in contrast, reduce the carbon intensity of imports. These policies also increase import volumes, and on balance, this results in a modest increase in imported emissions, which suggests that these type of policies may encourage demand for cleaner imported goods or help shift supply chains towards cleaner products. Last but not least, we see that non-market-based instruments such as standards do not have a significant effect on imported emissions and import volumes, but they tend to decrease the carbon intensity of imports. So the policy message of this slide is that the instrument choice matters. So different policy tools can have different effects, not only on the amount of imports, but also on whether those imports become cleaner or dirtier. The next question is how large the resulting carbon leakage rates are. So what we find is that on average, the average leakage rates across countries is modest and around 11%. At the same time, this average hides important heterogeneity. So carbon leakage rates are higher for small open economies, such as Malta and Costa Rica, and for carbon-intensive sectors, such as basic metals and chemicals. However, many country sector pairs with high leakage rates often account for less than 5% of manufacturing employment. And most sectors with high employment share face very low leakage rates often. And this matters for policy design as it suggests that leakage risks are real, but concentrated in some sectors. And this in turn strengthens the case for targeted responses to address leakage risks rather than broad measures that would apply equally across all sectors. Let me then conclude with three takeaways. So first, carbon leakage is moderate on average, but varies across countries and sectors. Second, the main channel driving leakage is import volumes and not a broad shift towards tertiary imports. This is an important finding because it can mitigate some concerns that unilateral climate policies necessarily undermine global emission reduction. And last but not least, we find that different climate policy instruments yield different leakage effects. So the policy implication is therefore not to avoid ambitious climate policy, rather it is to design policy mixes in a careful way. And so well-designed combinations of market-based instruments, standards, and technology support can address leakage and competitive concerns while preserving incentives to source cleaner imports from abroad. And considering the time, let me stop here.
Thank you so much, Yannick. Without further ado, let me move to the Q&A section of our Green Talks. Let me remind the audience that you have an opportunity to ask questions using the Zoom Q&A function. And we have already gathered a number of questions. So let me start right away. Yannick, a question for you from Dr. Mohammad Nazir Uddin. How can current climate policies effectively reduce global emissions while preventing carbon leakage to less regulated economies without undermining the competitiveness of developing countries? Over to you, Yannick.
Well, I think the last part of my presentation aligns very well with what we have heard earlier today about the effectiveness of policies on domestic emission reductions. I think one of the main takeaways there is that a combination of different policy instruments could result in efficient and effective emission reductions, also depending on the sector. And what I try to leave you with today in my talk is that actually the same applies for considerations regarding international spillover of policies. So, for instance, the technology support instruments that we have considered in our approach, they seem to reduce the carbon intensity of imports, and hence that would, from that perspective, limit carbon leakage, while at the same time providing sectors support to decarbonize. So I think that the key takeaway is that a well-designed policy mix can help in that regard.
Good, thanks for that, Yannick. I have a question from Vegard Hold-Hirsch to Annika. What has proven to be efficient climate policy for hard-to-abate industry sectors? Annika?
Yes. So for the industry sector, we find like a number of examples. One pretty big one is actually from China, where we find like that the price instruments were also successful. Exactly. And apart from that, I mean, yeah, we again see these like basically these differences by sector. So, for example, let me think of a good example. Yeah, I think the China is like the kind of most interesting one. Like we see, for example, that taxation or fossil fuel subsidy reforms were pretty successful here. We found about big breaks, like big emission reductions in Canada, in Ireland, in China, and in France. And across these, we have like an average emission reduction of like 18%. One thing that we don't really see as successful in this study in the industry sector are like information instruments. So we just haven't found them. We also see some successful performance standards or energy efficiency mandates as regulation policy, and in the subsidy space, the financing mechanisms stand out as successful in the industry sector. Yeah, this is basically the short summary. Overall, it's not the sector with the most emission reductions we found. So there's definitely still like a lot to do. That's probably the takeaway.
Yeah, well understood. Thanks, Annika. I have a question here for Eve. As we saw, there's similar answers, similar questions to the study of Annika and PIC colleagues. What are the key differences between your paper and the paper, and what are the similarities? Can you give us some more hint on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think, and Annika has to correct me on that. So I think the key difference is a bit the approach in the first place, right? So Annika and colleagues, they started with kind of looking at the emission breaks and then identifying policies kind of occurring around these breaks. So kind of their filtering strategy is basically to kind of focus on these kind of emission breaks. And the difference that we have is that we do not, in the first place, start with saying, okay, we focus on these breaks, but we kind of have other filters applying to kind of narrow down the number of policies we're looking at. What I found generally interesting and also surprising is that I actually expected our study to find more measures to being effective than Annika's, because I thought that we do not have a preconception about how the emissions has to occur to kind of show up in the data, right? So we did not look at these emission breaks, but had other approximations, but it turned out the other way around. So we appear to be more conservative than they were with our kind of 3 filtering strategies. So to kind of sum it up, I think that the difference was basically the way we kind of made this whole mass of policies kind of workable and digestible with the different kind of methodological approaches we used.
Thank you, Eve. More questions coming in from Muhammad Adskia Ferraman, probably for Daniel and also Yannick. In how far are existing fossil fuel subsidies relevant for carbon leakage prevention? Who would like to start first, Daniel or Yannick?
Yannick, you want to go ahead? It's more.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. Fossil fuel subsidies were one of the policy instruments that were not included in our study, because that is more of a technical explanation, because across countries the data did not vary enough. So that's a technical consideration. I would say in general, I think this depends on the stringency of these measures and on country-dependent context. So I find it hard to provide an overall general view on that.
Yeah.
Maybe just to complement. So I think, I mean, we also didn't explicitly look into fossil fuel subsidies, or at least in the relation to carbon leakage. But what we can definitely tell from the data is that fossil fuel subsidies, like most other market-based instruments, is actually also like one area that didn't see a lot of movement in the last 10 years. I mean, compared to non-market-based instruments, compared to regulations and so on and so forth. And then within the market-based instruments, so fossil fuel subsidies is actually like really one of the areas that showed the slowest movement. I mean, it was clearly outpaced by advances in emission trading schemes, in particular, advances in carbon taxes, and even it's on par with fuel excise taxes.
Thanks, Daniel. Jaime, did you want to intervene on the fossil fuel subsidy part?
Yeah, maybe more in general, although it wasn't part of the study. The fossil fuel subsidies have both a national connotation, so we look at national subsidies, and but there's also subsidies tied to international agreements. Think of shipping, or think of air freight, and so governments are now, certain governments, about 17 of them, are mapping to see what the national and the international subsidies are that they deliver, and to have a transition roadmap to see if their subsidies, which part of those subsidies are efficient, say they're attacking energy poverty or other issues, and which parts are inefficient, just grew over time and are kind of distorting a level playing field for all energy sources and should be placed away. So that research is starting. The OECD is reporting on fossil fuel subsidy globally, but there is a group of governments actually starting to map it out, and so that could then inform us in the future to see how that actually impacts the carbon leakage or other policies out there in the policy mix.
Thanks, Jaime. Very helpful reminder of the work that is beginning there. More question coming in from Sinia Anisimova, probably for Annika and Yves. Market-based instruments are effective in reducing emissions. They're also the most likely to trigger public contestation. We have seen this in France and in Australia and also in Canada. And this can stall climate action. What would be your advice for policymakers to mitigate such a negative effect? Annika, do you want to get started, and then I'll pass over to Yves?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so unfortunately, in a way, our study really focuses on like this one dimension, right, which is emissions reduction. I think it's actually the same for the other study, which is kind of one angle to look at this problem. But of course, for policy to be successful, there are also many other ingredients that have to be in the mix, like cost effectiveness, welfare aspects, public acceptance, and all of these things. So in the end, we can sort of give advice in this one direction, but we can't currently give like any scientific evidence to cover this whole pot in a way. So I think this would be a really interesting avenue for us in the future to understand how to also analyze kind of empirically and give this kind of evidence that can be helpful to policymakers that is more like multidimensional towards what we understand in success in a climate policy. But for now, we can unfortunately just tell them this policy was effective to reduce emissions, and then they have to have the hard job to consider all the different facets of implementation. And this is also where then the interdisciplinary aspect comes in, where a lot of like political scientists, people who do country case studies, which the type of work that really complements what we do, can come in with their advice and their expertise, and then everyone together can bring like a little piece to the puzzle to come up with a good result in the end. Yeah.
Thanks, Annika. I'll hand over to Yves before Jaime. I hand over to you for the wrap up since we're past with our time. So over to you, Yves, before I hand over to Jaime.
Yeah, I mean, my answer is a bit the same as Annika gave. So basically, this study is focused on effectiveness broadly, not really like on legitimacy, right? So kind of how these measures are perceived. That's a limitation. There are, however, I think like studies, more single case studies, or more like conjoined experiments, for example, from Liam Beiser McGrath in Advanced Science, where they kind of show citizens different designs for carbon taxes and basically ask them which one they like the most, and they vary features. And one that kind of improves generally the support for these measures is carbon. So it's this recycling, basically, that the money that you kind of earn with the taxes is not going into the state budget and then spent for something else, but either explicitly used, for example, to improve motorways, or kind of goes back to the people to support other kind of green transformative activities, right? So kind of reusing the money that you earn and not kind of just giving this to the budget is perhaps a way that kind of makes people be more supportive of carbon taxes in general.
Thank you, Yves. So as we come to the end of our Green Talks live webinar, let me hand over to our director, Jaime de Bourbon de Parme, for a few closing reflections. Jaime, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Natalie, and I just want to thank all the speakers. Natalie, you for moderating this session, but also Daniel, Annika, Yves, and Yannick for the excellent presentations. They were very insightful, even entertaining. I like the football analogy, which I hope the countries with good policy will start competing equally as in sports to improve their performance. And I hope that all of you online have enjoyed this, and that the discussion which climate policies actually deliver and under what conditions, that you can see the right data and the right analysis of all these institutions involved in this can really help governments decide which way they can deliver on climate action. So please use this data. This data is publicly available. It's a common good. Go on our website. There will be a link in the chat box towards our website, and please use it. And finally, I just want to thank all of you online to join us. And I hope you join again with the next Green Talk Live next time we gather again. Thank you very much.